Perfect. Well, I'll go ahead and kick it off. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Tuqar Rathi and would like to welcome you all to our very first annual GCP Education Series program for the FY 2021. According to Section E6, Clause 1.24 in the ICH dated April 1996, good clinical practice is defined as a standard of the design, conduct, performance, monitoring, auditing, recording, analyses, and reporting of clinical trials that provides assurance that the data and the reported results are credible and accurate, and that the rights, integrity, and confidentiality of the trial subjects are protected. So today's topic is very exciting, diversity trends and requirements in clinical research by Dr. Warren Chalklin. Dr. Warren Chalklin advances cultural competency, diversity, equity, and inclusion outcomes across Christus Health. He also leads the language access services as well as the execution of system-wide diversity and inclusion educational and operational strategies. He designs high-quality, cost-effective learning solutions by collaborating with system-wide clinical, non-clinical, and leadership teams, community partners, and other experts. So we're very excited to kind of have him as a speaker for today. Before we proceed, I'd like to make a few important disclosures. First, no conflicts were identified. Second, this activity did not receive any commercial support. Third, Christus Trinity Mother Francis System is an approved provider for CE by the Louisiana Nurses Association approver and accredited approver by the ANCC. Fourth, to receive contact hours for this nursing education activity, the participant must register, attend the entire activity, and complete the evaluation tool within specified time frame of 7 days. Once successful completion has been verified, a certificate of successful completion will be awarded for 1 contact hour. And lastly, Christus Trinity Mother Francis System is accredited by LMA to also provide CME for physicians. At this time, I'd like to request you to please place your call-in devices on mute, and if you have not already done so. And if you're attending in a group setting or dialing in from a phone other than in your office, you must send an RSVP to christus.irb@christushealth.org so we may accurately log your individual attendance. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Warren Chalklin.
Thank you so much, Tuqar. I really appreciate that and just the opportunity to be here with each of you today. Part of my goal for today is to really not only present some content, but also to engage with each of you and to really think about the relationship between power and research in the context of diversity. When we think about research, the dominant paradigm is that research is a neutral exercise in which there is a neutral relationship between the researcher and the researched. What we're going to be talking about today is a slightly sort of critique of that idea of research. And I come from the perspective that in any interaction between two individuals, two human beings, there is a inherently unneutral relationship between those two individuals because we exist in a world in which power operates. And so traditionally research has been framed, particularly in laboratory settings, as this very, causation and correlation piece of in a lab, for example. But when we begin to deal with human beings, there is a social, cultural, and political context that's very, very important for us to all understand, to unpack, to analyze, and to think about how those relationships might be impacting our results, our design, and ultimately the ways in which research reaches the desired goals. And I'll just begin by posing two provocative questions that I often begin conversations about to introduce this topic quite clearly to us. Firstly, in our work, there is a lot of understanding and questioning and guidelines around the patient, who they are, their background. We think about the relationships that they may have and how that might be impacting the reason why they come into the hospital in the first place or the clinic. But not many questions are asked about the doctor or the provider and their experiences and how they come into the interaction with the patient. And so when we think about the fact that the doctor is not a neutral being, they come into any encounter with a patient with their lived experiences, we begin to see disparities emerging in the ways in which patients are treated and doctors are treated. For example, a review of over 1,500 studies that looked at the biases, the unconscious biases of doctors, they found that over 65% of doctors had some form of unconscious bias that impacted their relationship with the patient. Now, in the context of research, that kind of relationship is exactly the same thing. Often the questions are about the research, the folks, our participants in our trials. But I'm turning the lens in this presentation and asking questions about the researcher. Who is the researcher? How does the researcher's lived experience, how does the researcher's position as a researcher impact the study and impact the results? And so that's the perspective I'm coming from. I'm turning the lens from the researched to the researcher. Having said that, what we'll be talking a little bit about in terms of our learning outcomes is we will think about diversity, ethics, and research. We'll think about the relationship between those three components. We will reflect on how forms of power shape research studies and results. And what I mean by power is the fact that in certain situations, in certain contexts, we have political, social, economic power that impacts the ways in which research takes place. For example, often research is conducted by those who have educational authority, whether they have PhDs, whether they have MDs, EDDs, or whether they have the authority of an institution. And often the folks that are being researched do not have that same authority, which may be one of the reasons why they are being researched in the first place. And so automatically there is a power imbalance that exists between the researcher and the researched. Without analyzing that power imbalance, we can often produce results. We can often design our methodologies that can produce problematic outcomes and even problematic results that are not accurate. And so if we can analyze power and reflect on how and design our studies and design our processes to mitigate the impact of imbalances of power, we can begin to then create socially just research. Finally, one of the areas that is critically important, particularly in the context that we live in today, is language access services, and what it means to enter a research space and conduct research with participants who may not speak English as a first language. So what I'll be talking about today is research and power, and then looking at one form of identity, particularly language, and talking through some of those issues. This will be an interactive session. I will be asking you to be brave, to understand that my role is to move within the zone of proximal development. Where you are is what you know right now, and my goal is to shift your understanding to what you don't know. We all have that. And that process can be very uncomfortable. And so my role here as a facilitator in this conversation is to begin to ask some questions about power, begin to ask some difficult questions, some sensitive questions, to begin to emerge some issues that are always present in any research situation, but are not always analyzed and thought through fully in research contexts. So what is the relationship between diversity, ethics, and research? For those who have gone through the IRB process, there are many, many questions about ethical treatment. And really what it comes down to is the question of dignity, the question of whether the researcher and the researched have a relationship, or the interaction is one of dignity and human respect, respect for the essence of the human being. So what I want to do is ask the question about the context in which the human being lives, and begin to think about the dignity around that person. So all research is conducted in a context, okay? All contexts are embedded with social, economic, and political power. Therefore, research is shaped by issues of power and can never be neutral. Now, that can be a very controversial statement in the research world, because people will say, well, I conducted the research, I have a huge number of participants, and so any biases will be reduced by the large number of people that I have studied, for example. But the question is, that study has occurred within a racial context, it has occurred within a genderized context, and how have those impacted the results? And that's the question I'm sort of trying to raise. So when we think about diversity, often people will say, yeah, diversity is just about difference. I am different to you. I am South African. And you might be from a different country. You might be from a different state. You might have completely different life experiences to myself. So that is diversity. That is difference. The question in research is not only about the difference, but about how power operates to exploit those differences. And often folks are researched because they are different, but there isn't a lot of consideration in some cases to how those differences exist in a social context that makes those vulnerabilities, that makes those differences sources of vulnerabilities. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And the reason why we have such ethical guidelines and guardrails when we conduct research is because often folks have made very, very unethical decisions as it relates to vulnerable populations. There's a reason why it is incredibly difficult to obtain acceptance of an IRB to research prison populations, to research children. There's very, very key vulnerable populations that it is possible to get approval, but the process is a lot more arduous. And that is because there are ethical questions around that. So inherently, research has begun to really identify that there is a power dynamic, that there are some ethical questions that live within the research world. At the same time, I think that ethics and diversity are strongly correlated. Not only are these ethical questions, but these are also diversity-related questions. So we're going to unpack a little bit about what that means through some interaction and some conversation together. So I'm just giving us a broad framework for now. When we think about ethical boundaries in research, we can often think about how unjust use of authority, unjust use of power has produced those ethical boundaries that we have. So when we think about the classic unjust experiments that have been conducted, or unethical experiments that have been conducted, often it is the exploitation of difference, it is the exploitation of someone's diversity that has resulted in what we would consider an unethical situation. And therefore those rules came out to mitigate, to say we do not want any type of reproduction of such a situation because of the harm that it has had on the researched. And just as an example, the Nazi experimentation on Jewish people led to the Nuremberg Code. It would be remiss of us to not think about the context in which Nazis were able to experiment freely, were able to conduct research without any guardrails, without really understanding that the Jewish participants, the researched, were a vulnerable population. It was because they were Jewish that they were placed in the context of unequal power distribution. It is because of the Holocaust that Jewish people were rounded up and placed in situations in which they were experimented upon. And so just as the Nuremberg Code came out of that, we have to, as researchers, think about those micro moments in which these similar type of power dynamics might play out. So let's move from the abstract and get a little bit more concrete together and unpack a little bit more about what this looks like. So when we think about the researched, the patient, for example, they come into any experience with a set of filters. I'm looking at the left-hand side of the screen, and I'm saying that they come into any experience with past experience, as I mentioned, culture, education, knowledge, gender, and class. And as I mentioned earlier, the focus is often on them. But very little times do we sit back and think about the researcher. Who is the researcher? What culture do they come from? What education do they come from? What knowledge, gender, class, social stance, and race do they occupy? And how does that create the assumptions through which the research is conducted? For example, in South Africa, where I'm from, when I conducted research, there were certain contexts in which I, as a white male, could not necessarily get accurate results because of the history of segregation in South Africa. There's a huge mistrust with certain populations, rightly so. And so I went in asking questions, and I realized that there was a social barrier to my research. There was a social, my colleagues were getting very rich qualitative data, and I was getting very, I would say almost non-existent data. And so my position as a white male in that situation shaped my experience. In addition, it shaped the perspectives of the researched. They had a history. Apartheid, unlike the US, we have a history of medical research being conducted on vulnerable populations, in some cases without those vulnerable populations' consent. Okay, and so I was living in history. I was living in a moment in which there was a huge mistrust because they saw me and were reminded of the context from which they came. And so there's a perception, there's a perceived reality that exists between these two individuals in any context. And that shapes our behavior. That shapes the things we say, the things we do not say, the trust that we have and the trust that we do not have, the ways in which we are present in any context. And so my argument is not that those who occupy certain positions, so for example, me as a white male, my argument is not that I cannot go and interview or conduct research with context with people who do not look like me. That is not what I'm arguing. What I'm arguing is that in our design, in the ways in which we think about our research, we have to account for the ways in which power operate. We have to think about what the historical context of that community is all about. We have to think about the ways in which my position could be perceived by the patient, and what sort of trust do I need to, what kind of background or work do I need to do to then create the trust that can then enable an environment in which I can sit down and interview somebody, for example. Conversely, when we went to very conservative white communities in South Africa, my black colleagues experienced racial discrimination. And so my data was incredibly thick, and their data was almost non-existent. And so we had to find ways in our research process to think about that. If we did not, we would be producing results that were completely skewed. We would have results in some contexts that were absolutely, we would present them as the truth, as our results. But in actuality, there is a big gap between what the patients were saying and the results that we were presenting. And that's the kind of situation that I want us to think about. So we're going to watch a video, which is a pretty famous video. It's the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. And what I'm going to ask is for us to think about these three questions. How is social power operating in the study? How is political power shaping this research study? How is economic power impacting this research study? Okay. When we think about social power, I want us to think about the relationships between the researcher and the researched. When we think about political power, I'd like for us to think about the institutions. I'd like for us to think about how the institutions give authority and what that looks like. What is political power doing in this experiment? Okay. Economic power, what is the role of resources and money in this situation? How does that impact the study? So we're going to watch this video twice, and then we're going to come back and I'm going to call on some folks to then report back on social power, political power, and economic power. So please, if you have a pen and pencil, please be ready to take some notes, and we'll get right into this video. Again, we're going to watch it twice.
In July of 1972, the Washington Star newspaper broke the story about the controversial Tuskegee Institute syphilis experiment. For 40 years, from 1932 until 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service, in partnership with Tuskegee, secretly studied the effects of untreated syphilis in African American men in Alabama. 600 black men, 399 with syphilis and 201 without the disease, were induced to participate in the experiment. Nearly all of them were poorly educated, impoverished sharecroppers. In exchange for participating, they were promised free medical exams, hot meals, and a burial stipend. The men with syphilis were not told they were infected and were not treated, even after penicillin was discovered to be an effective cure for the disease in the 1940s. Over the course of the experiment, 128 participants died of syphilis or syphilis-related complications. In 1972, when the paper exposed the details, the experiment was still ongoing. It incited public outrage over the unethical treatment of the participants, which led to the experiment's termination that November. The following year, the NAACP filed suit on behalf of the survivors. The federal government settled the lawsuit for $10 million. It also agreed to provide survivors and their infected family members with free medical services. In July of 1972, the Washington Star newspaper broke the story about the controversial Tuskegee Institute syphilis experiment. For 40 years, from 1932 until 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service, in partnership with Tuskegee, secretly studied the effects of untreated syphilis in African American men in Alabama. 600 black men, 399 with syphilis and 201 without the disease, were induced to participate in the experiment. Nearly all of them were poorly educated, impoverished sharecroppers. In exchange for participating, they were promised free medical exams, hot meals, and a burial stipend. The men with syphilis were not told they were infected and were not treated, even after penicillin was discovered to be an effective cure for the disease in the 1940s. Over the course of the experiment, 128 participants died of syphilis or syphilis-related complications. In 1972, when the paper exposed the details, the experiment was still ongoing. It incited public outrage over the unethical treatment of the participants, which led to the experiment's termination that November. The following year, the NAACP filed suit on behalf of the survivors. The federal government settled the lawsuit for $10 million. It also agreed to provide survivors and their infected family members with free medical services.
Okay, let us reflect about social power, political power, and economic power. So let's begin with social power. Please, if you could unmute yourself and reflect on what you saw when it comes to social power, when we're thinking about relationships between the researcher and the research. What did we see?
Well, I don't know if I'm supposed to talk, but I will anyways because I can't.
Please do.
This is unbelievable. Well, for me, social power, the U.S. Public Health Department conducting studies on poorly educated men, and with a promise of health assessments and food, and I don't like that third promise of a burial stipend. That's kind of crazy, but that's, of course, if I were one of those poorly educated men, I would have trusted that the U.S. Public Health Department was going to work for the best interest, for my best interest. So I would have assumed that. So that's for the social power. That's how I look at it. It's this huge U.S. Public Health Department treating these individuals, and of course, I totally see why they trusted.
Thank you, Marcos. Absolutely. So we as researchers come into any context with some authority, and it's not always that the researched trust us as the researcher, but they trust that the institution that's behind us, they're trusting that institution. So for example, in this case, they're trusting the institution of the U.S. Health Department. They're trusting that institution to have their best interests at heart as U.S. citizens. Okay. So absolutely, that trust is what essentially gives those participants the sort of ease to then begin to allow themselves to engage in this study. Okay. Let me ask the question about political power. I mean, the institution of the US government is a political source of power, but let me keep the question open. How is social power, political power, or economic power impacting the study? What does anybody else think on the call? By the way, thank you, Marcos. Let's hear some other voices in this.
Hey, Warren, this is Patrick. It just makes me wonder, those who are conducting the study, those caring for those men, doing experiments, basically. I wonder how they thought of these men. What level of dignity did they think that they really had, if any? And that's what's heartbreaking. And for it to happen over a period of 40 years is just shocking that this continued, which means that they really did not consider that these men had dignity and were worthy of dignity, as they were, and probably the particular class of people they came from.
Absolutely. The question of why did they choose these men to begin with? The narrator mentioned these men had a low level of education. These men were impoverished. And so there is a question about the dignity of these men. And it's possible, I'm not saying it is, but I'm saying it's possible that they were chosen specifically because they were vulnerable. They were chosen specifically because they would not be able to perhaps afford lawyers, for example. They were chosen specifically because they occupied a certain class position, a certain race position. Notice that the researchers were white. That is a key element to this study. When we think about the racial context of the United States, in the 1940s, when this study was administered, the social power between Black Americans and white Americans was very disproportionate. And the fact that the study was endorsed by the US government for over 40 years, we have to think about that. Now, let me ask one more question about the question of rewards, the question of money, the question of burial, the question of hot meals. In our research, we often ask the question, how can we get more participants to participate? And we often think, well, we can just give people money. We can often just give people resources. How could that shape a research study? You know, if you go to someone who's living on the street and say, well, I'll give you a hot meal if you'll answer all my questions. How can those questions of power impact a study? So I'm just throwing some questions out there, but if anybody wants to think about social, political, economic power, let's hear some more voices. And I'll hear from 2 more people.
Yes, hi, this is Sherry Wachtel.
Hi, Sherry.
I think I agree with you. I think they definitely chose this population for a reason. Just in thinking through it and having read through this, you know, so many times over the years, I think they selected that population for one reason, because it was a population that, had they not intervened, I think this was their reasoning. I'm not saying it's right, but had they not intervened, this is a population that would have gone untreated and that would have died because they don't know how to access the resources that are out there and available, or the money, or the education, or those types of things. So it almost seems to me like they use that to their advantage, their social economic stature, if you will, intentionally, and use the stipend of a funeral benefits, because these are people that they didn't know that penicillin would cure their stuff. They didn't know that they had access to medical care, or how to get it. You know, now today we have navigators that go out and help indigent people find their way through the medical system and things. They didn't have that then. And so I think they I get the impression that they intentionally used them and provided stipends to basically bribe them to participate specifically for that reason. I don't know if that makes sense, but that...
Absolutely. There's a knowledge asymmetry between the researcher and the research. There's things that the researcher knows that especially in this context, that the research, the men, had no idea.
Right. And if I don't tell them, they wouldn't have known anyway, so I can go ahead and study them. I mean, that's the impression I get.
Absolutely. So we as researchers have to understand that, and there's also an incentive not to provide them information to enhance their health. There's absolutely no incentive for the researchers to provide the fact that, hey, we actually have a cure for this. Because once they have a cure, then there's no study.
Then they lose their person in the study. Exactly.
Yes,
and then they tell everybody else in the study.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm not gonna, if there's one more person, I want to make sure we have enough time for the question and answers at the end of this, but I just want to ask one more person to help us reflect for a moment on the question of power. Anybody else? Okay, thank you for these wonderful responses. We have to turn ourselves into not just observers of this research process, but think about ourselves from the position of the researchers, because these men represent any participant in any research study, and these researchers can represent any researcher in any study. And so we have to think about whether people will ask these similar questions when they are thinking through our results in our study. When we think about the results of this study, we can often question the methodologies. We can question the fact that we can sort of unravel this entire experiment because of the context of racial discrimination, because of the context of exploitation. Those are really, really key themes that we can only unpack by understanding who the researcher was and their intentions.
Warren, can I say something real quick?
Please.
I was just thinking about, if I'm the researcher and I have a huge grant from the public health department to do this, and I say, hey, you can get cured when I see that, this individual's going down, my salary, my job will be impacted, and I can make decisions based on what's best for me.
Absolutely. The question of grants is a huge one. It's a massive one. All right. I'm trying to get out of Zoom's annotation. Just give me one moment while I erase the screen for a second. Okay, wonderful. So we have to think about the fact that diversity is what makes us all unique, but there are elements that are of diversity that are valued differently within certain contexts. For example, in certain cultures, having weight on one's body is seen as a sign of health, not shame. And these affect the research context. When someone says, "Are you healthy?" I see that you're obese, but you also indicated that you're healthy. Those can be really culturally specific components. We have to think about power asymmetry between the researcher and the researched. We have to understand the language we use. When we say to someone who's participating that I got IRB approval, do they even understand what that means? Okay, do they even understand what confidentiality means? These words are very, very research specific. And we have to have a way of making sure folks understand those words. Okay, we have to understand that ethics is embedded in culture. And for certain contexts, certain questions, for example, are completely inappropriate because of their cultural significance. Asking about the menstruation of a woman, for example, in certain cultures is absolutely taboo. So we have to think about whether the participant is, and this is just a sort of mild example of the Tuskegee experiment, right? If the participant is not answering your question, is it because it might be a culturally insensitive question? Okay, it may not be ethically incorrect or wrong, it just might be culturally specific, all right? So the final takeaway, I think, which is important, is that research with humans and non-human animals it occurs in a context of power. We have to reflect on that. Now, one of the areas that I see this playing out is language. The question of English, the power of English in the research context. So what I want to do very quickly is unpack what it looks like in different medical facilities across the nation and across the world when folks may look exactly like me, folks may have the same background as me, but the fact that I speak English is another area, may advantage me in some areas and may disadvantage someone else in another. Okay, so just for a moment, take a moment to reflect on this situation.
Little doctor on Mountain Dew. That's Tandora.
Excuse me, sir. I'm so sorry. She's been crying nonstop. She has a temperature of 105. I don't know what to do.
Maravidig. Viperolis lasan.
No, please. Just every time I feed her, she throws up.
Viperolis lasan.
What are you saying? Can you just look at her? No, she's burning up.
Viperolis la anglan.
No, what? She's burning up. Feel her head.
Tranquilly. The mother is Askan.
What is he doing?
Do you have?
My baby, she's got a temperature of 105. Every time I feed her, she throws up. Please, can you? She's burning up. Feel her head.
Moravidig.
Please, just feel her head. Feel her head. Just someone let me in to see the doctor. I don't think anyone understand what I'm saying. Please, someone help me.
Okay. So I've taken the question of language and I've put it in a medical context, but this can also be applicable to a research context. So I want to ask the question, what is the relationship between language and care in this video? And if you could also take a moment to reflect on the relationship between language and research in this video. And please feel free to shout out. We do have 10 more minutes, and I have a few more slides to get through. So we're going to take two folks. One person, if you can reflect on the relationship between language and care, and the second person to reflect on the relationship between language and research. Please unmute yourself and feel free to shout out. And please remember, you might be on mute. We cannot hear you if you're on mute. So
I was on mute because you didn't respond to what I was saying. What I was saying was that, yes, there was a great problem there because of the language barrier, because the mother was fraught and, just, excited because her kid needed help, and she couldn't get it across to the people there that should have been there to help her. But because of the barrier, because she couldn't describe what she actually needs, it turned into a hysterical situation there.
Absolutely. Thank you. So that's the relationship between care. They can't provide care because they can't understand. And what about the relationship between language and research? How could we see this kind of situation being applicable to a research context?
I think it would be the same way, because trying to explain, the informed consent and what the actual project research is, if you have a difficulty with the language between the two, it causes a barrier in explaining actually what the program is for, or the research is for, the benefits of it, and also the risk of it. So, the researched person doesn't understand what the researcher is trying to do. So it causes great difficulty there with the communication on that part.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And this is an example of a situation that happened where a Spanish-speaking boy of Cuban descent presented with abnormal mental status, complaining of intoxicado. An untrained interpreter understood this to mean that the boy was intoxicated, though in the Cuban dialect, the boy was actually saying that he was nauseated. He received care for a drug overdose attributed to substance abuse, but developed paraplegia and subsequently found to be due to a ruptured intracranial aneurysm. The case led to malpractice lawsuit of $71 million. So the question of whether we understand the patient or we understand the person being researched and they understand us is critical. The language is often the bridge in terms of research and in care. So the key thing that we have to unpack as researchers is the question of meaning. Does the patient and the provider have a shared meaning? Does the researcher and the researched have a shared meaning? And meaning is linked to understanding. A lack of understanding can result in harm, inaccurate findings, and unethical research procedures. Language is not only about what is said, but also about non-verbal meanings. When we research, when we conduct interviews and we look eye to eye with somebody and they keep looking down, for example, because looking them in the eye is disrespectful, or the opposite, not looking them in the eye is disrespectful. We have to understand how those meanings, how those misunderstandings and understandings contribute to the data, contribute to the findings of the data. And so it is important for me to share the fact that language access, a person's right to have care and to be able to understand what the research process is all about, is not only an ethical requirement, it is also a legal requirement. And perhaps the most important thing to I'm going to just go back for a second and just take you through the following highlights. First things first, when we think about research, we have to make sure that the patient or the participant understands both consent and the harms related to the research. We have to think about equitable subject selection. Who is being selected and why? We spoke about that. We unpacked that earlier with the Tuskegee experiment. We thought about identifying the study subject's communication and linguistic needs. We will talk about interpreting in a moment, but understand that we have to make sure that we have full-length translated informed documents in the participants' language, that they understand, that they really are fully aware of both the benefits and the harms related to the study. We have to make sure that we file those translated consent forms, and that's part of the documentation, all right? And we are not allowed at any time to use minors or family members as interpreters, whether that's in a clinical setting or a research setting. That is, unless a patient, for example, signs a waiver to that degree, we cannot simply use somebody in the waiting room to interpret for us when we're conducting research. There's a defined process that we have to move through. And so when we think about this, I want to make sure that we understand the difference between interpretation and translation. In a research context, your consent form, which is a written document, is a translation. Any spoken interpretation between, for example, a researcher and a participant is interpretation. There's an interpreter that is a human being. There is a translation, which is a document. So anything written down is a translation. Anything spoken is an interpretation. Often we get those mixed up. Sight translation occurs when an interpreter reads a document that might be in English and summarizes that document in Spanish, for example, for the participant. So the participant may have read the Spanish document, but may not necessarily have understood fully some of the implications. The interpreter could look at the English document for perhaps more explanation and then summarize, sight translate some of those concepts to the patient. That's what we call sight translation. Sight translation is written, interpretation is oral, sight translation is a combination of the two. Now, it's not translating the entire document, it's just summaries. Okay. So I want to just give us a sense of the kinds of interpreters that are often used in research studies. And we offer on-site live professional interpreters. These are folks that are trained medical interpreters, for example. We then have a qualified bilingual staff who are employees that are bilingual, that have been certified to provide interpreting services. We have document translation. Anytime you have to conduct a study, you submit those English documents, for example, to be translated into the language of service to the participant. We also offer video remote interpreting, which is an iPad or some sort of device that can then, in some cases, verify what the live interpreter might be saying, for example. Sometimes there's questions about the quality of an interpreter, so you have a stopgap with a video remote interpreter. We also have over-the-phone interpretation. Often this won't be used in research unless you're doing phone research, in which you may be interacting with somebody that does not speak English. You can then dial a number, and that will connect you with an interpreter, and there will be a three-way conversation, yourself, the interpreter, and the participant. So I want to go through just very, very briefly. I have 3 minutes left. In terms of the QBS program, don't worry about the slide. I'm going to talk you through. Don't worry about these. I just want to talk you through one quick thing on the slide. If you can move your eyes to the right-hand side where you see qualified bilingual staff interpreter, we have level 1 and level 2. A level 1 interpreter can do basic interpretation. A level 2 interpreter can do basic interpretation and medical terminology. So a medical terminology could include words like cardiology, oncology, diabetes. These folks are able to interpret those concepts into the desired language, whereas a level 1 is only able to say things like, what's your address, when's your birthday, how old are you, things like that. Okay, so if you are deciding to work with limited English proficient or non-English speaking subjects, this is the process. This is 2 slides. I'm going to walk through this process. I'm also going to send the PowerPoint, but I just want to talk it through with you. Okay. So let's say your study is not with anybody who speaks a language other than English. Okay. You can proceed with that study in English. There's no need for translations or interpretations. But let's say you are dealing with limited English proficient or non-English proficient populations. You would then have to think about working with you have to make sure that your documents have been translated, and you have to assign a QBS, at least a QBS level 2. I'll talk about the ABS and ABC later, but I just want to focus on QBS level 2 for this presentation, okay? You would have to make sure that you have interpreters that can interpret medical terminology. So let's say if your study is not emphasizing them, then here we go. Is the principal investigator, research staff, or consent designee an interpreter? Let's say they are. Then you can begin to use, they are legally allowed to interpret in a research. So if the principal investigator has a level 2 they can then interpret in a study. Okay, they can make sure that they are able to then conduct interviews and interpret between the researcher and the participant. Okay, but let's say they are not. Let's say they are not. Oh, my apologies. There's two things I didn't mention. The principal investigator must ensure that the consent form has been translated to the target language, and that the original signed and dated English version of the consent form is kept with the translated version of that form. Okay, so we have an English version and a Spanish version, for example. Now let's say the principal investigator is not a QBS. Their first step would be to find an interpreter, okay, to locate a professional interpreter or QBS interpreter. They could also contract with an interpreter, all right? And then they would go through the same process of ensuring that the documents are, that there's an idea of which languages are needed, that the documents are translated into those languages, and that the process of the English consent form and the target language consent form is taken forward. Okay. Now, let's think about when you're walking through this process, what that could look like if when all your documents must be translated prior to the study. Okay, so let's say, for example, you know that you're going into a Spanish-speaking area. What does that look like for you? This is a situation in which you realize that there's a patient, for example, that speaks Spanish only. As you're going into the study, as you're going into the community, some might speak English, some might speak Spanish, and you're in that moment of trying to figure that piece out. That's this slide. The next slide is, you're purposefully going in to study a population that does not speak English. What does that look like? Firstly, you translate all the documents. That's the first step. Then you ask yourself, is the PI QBS level 2? If they are, again, we go through that same process. Okay, if they are, yes, they are. We make sure that the level 2 is interpreting within the research context. We make sure that the person has signed the consent form in the language of their choice, which has already been translated. Okay, we ensure that they have all the understandings, that the person being researched has the understanding of the harm and the benefits of the research study. And again, the same process happens if the PI is not a QBS level 2, and I'm just going to run through those really quickly. The same process that we talked about in the slide earlier is the same process that you go through now. Again, I will send these slides to you. I want to make sure that we have some time for question and answer. So on that note, I will be opening up for questions, but the key thing that I want to take away, that I want everybody on this call to take away, is the question of power and research, the question of understanding, and the question of the process for interpreting document translation and site translation. Those key things are really, really important. On that note, I'd love to open up for some questions. So please, we have, I think, about 10 minutes per car. From my understanding, you also have a few things to say. So I'm going to stop right there and open up for some questions. All right. If you could please, if the person could please spotlight my video, I'd appreciate it. And if there's any questions, please feel free. Okay.
Warren, this is Pukar. Excellent lecture, very thought-provoking slides and the topics. So this was very, very engaging for the team. We truly appreciate this. One question that comes to our mind is, what are some of the ways we can employ in reducing the bias related to the power, be it the social, be it the economic. So when we are simply thinking from the research standpoint, what recommendations may you have for our team in possibly reducing these power-related biases should they come into play?
Yes, that's a great question. So I think one of the tools that I've seen used a lot is as research teams, we would often talk about who we are. We would do some storytelling about our experiences. We would come to check our biases. In addition to that, we would then ask those questions. So we would be very clear about what our biases are. For example, when I see people from South Africa, I'm here in the United States, I get incredibly happy. And I, have an unintentional bias for South Africans. Now, if I'm a researcher and I'm on a team and I find a South African who is a participant, it's likely that I would have a bias for that researcher. So in checking my bias, I may ask you, hey, Pukar, please could you be the person who conducts the interview with this particular person because I have a bias here that might affect the results. And so continuously being aware as a team of who we are, our life stories, and how those might impact the research space is helpful in the design and the collection of the research. The second place where it's really important is the results. The question of, when looking at these results, asking the simple question, is it possible that biases could be impacting these results? In my analysis of these results, are there people who, when we do control groups, we do that specifically to mitigate bias, okay? But sometimes in the research design, we don't necessarily have those checks for ourselves as researchers. And so sometimes it's really helpful to have folks who are outside of the study just to sit in and listen objectively to how we're talking about the study, because we become embedded in the results, we become embedded in the study, we become invested in the study. As we saw in the Stanford experiment, we become invested, and then we don't necessarily maintain our quote-unquote objectivity. So that's really what I would recommend. As a part, threaded throughout, is just checking our biases, checking our understandings as a team.
Those are valuable recommendations. Thank you so much for sharing with the team.
Thank you.
Other questions for Warren?
I just have a comment, more so than a question. Warren, wonderful presentation, by the way. But I guess just for everyone out there, the issue of language is really important because often it becomes sort of a spoken or unspoken matter of exclusion in research. Like sometimes in a lot of studies, like non-English speaking status or limited English proficiency is actually listed as among the exclusion criteria. So the fact that we're making our studies available to people who have limited English proficiency, sorry, my air conditioner is really loud, or who don't speak English is really important. So I think that as we're working to continue to make this more and more available to those people, that will just continue to advance like research, period. So just continue to work for those things. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Addison. It's a pleasure to hear your voice again. It's been a while. Thank you for sharing.
This is great. If are there any more questions? Last call. If not,
so
go ahead.
Pukar, so there's no more, I don't have a question, but I just want to make a comment that the disclosure and evaluation is usually included in the PowerPoint. However, we didn't include it this time. So we'll make sure you guys get it right after this presentation. Okay?
Yes, and I know those are verbally announced, but having that in writing would be helpful. Thank you. All right, so I know we're right at 1 o'clock. Thank you so much, Warren, for your time in joining our GCP Lecture Series program today. This was so good, we may have to put you on a permanent roster, so we'll talk about it.
Great,
but
thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for your attendance. Be sure to complete the evaluation so we can award you the earned hour, as well as if you have not called in from your direct line, please send an email to the IRB inbox so we can log your attendance and ensure that the follow-up packet goes out to you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or YouTube for health updates, information about new physicians and